begin with question number one. I think it's fair to say that everyone on stage agrees that behind-the-meter energy resources like solar and storage are having or will have profound impacts on the way electric companies serve their customers and operate their energy grids. And as many jurisdictions begin to navigate this change, the following questions come to mind. Who is allowed to play in behind-the-meter solar and storage markets? Who owns these resources? And how do we structure these markets and services so that all customers benefit and can participate? And I thought I'd start with Frank, and if you could kindly give us your perspective. There you are. And you have 4 minutes.
I'd like to start with a discussion a little bit about the framework in which these kinds of innovations must take place. In particular, the framework that we really need to keep our eye on, and I think it's probably been discussed today, certainly it probably will be in the future as well during this conference, is the grid itself. The grid is really essential in order to enable the operation of all of these new technologies, all these distributed energy resources, and the different pieces of the system that are going to be allowing the system to adopt new behind-the-meter technologies. Importantly now, the grid is also closely linked to the financial health of the utility. It's not shocking that I would say that, of course, because again, that's part of my employment agreement. But the utility itself has to be able to be financially viable and subject to regulation. It has to be able to make the kinds of investments in the grid that will enable this kind of evolution and revolution to take place. DERs have got to be integrated into the grid. They're often not controllable. They present significant problems in the grid, and reliability has still got to be our watchword. Low cost has still got to be our watchword. So it's important to understand that DER customers, even after they become DER customers, are really still customers of the utility too, because they're taking grid services. So with that as a background, I'll say from the point of view of most utilities, Xcel Energy is no different. We believe strongly that DERs are part of our future, and we think there should be a role for third parties in this process as well. However, we also think it's going to be important that whoever plays in this and whatever kind of technologies are being brought to bear in the grid, all players need to pay for their fair share of the grid services that are provided. This gets, of course, into some of the solar debates that have been going on across the nation for a while. But it's absolutely critical that we do a good job of making sure that those third parties do pay for the grid services that enable their very existence on the grid. There's also some of these products, such as storage, that have inherent grid qualities to them. Storage is more than just shifting power from when it's available to when it's not, or shifting energy from off-peak to on-peak times. Storage is really about a number of different factors that are important to maintaining the grid, such as voltage support, frequency control, ramping, avoiding investments in distribution system. All those things are really grid-specific issues. If you have those kind of values that you're getting out of storage, which are going to be critical to making storage function, then you need to make sure that in some way utilities have the ability to control, plan for, and understand how storage works. I would even argue that aggregation of storage, which is an issue that is becoming a bigger and bigger deal that we saw even in that FERC NOPR earlier this year, is something that is fundamentally a utility function. Adding together all of these different distributed resources really is an important piece of what the utility does. So one of the questions that we're supposed to answer here is who gets to play in this? I know a lot of jurisdictions right now are thinking maybe utilities should not be allowed to play in these markets. It will come as no surprise to you that I disagree with that. We think it's important. I think most utilities would agree that if you're going to create a truly competitive platform for these kinds of resources, that utilities should have at least the opportunity to play in these markets in an important way. So that's it.
Thank you, Frank. And Roger, what are your thoughts?
Thanks. My name is Roger Smith. I run the global utilities business for Oracle. And Lisa always calls me to participate in these things and says, can you be a little more controversial. And so I guess maybe that's my role. So with that as a preface, let me just step into this and talk about the question maybe a little differently than most would address it. But clearly there's no stopping technology in this industry today, especially with the market potential. And those of us who are in the technology businesses today see huge potential in this marketplace. But to be very frank about it, the rate of adoption for us in this industry is probably slower than most. And so I think we need some paradigm shifts. And as I sat with my counterparts in Oracle and talked about where our industry is going, let me give you some comments that they fed back to me. And this is where Lisa starts twitching in her chair. But we started talking about, for example, solar, rooftop solar. And my counterparts in Oracle go, yeah, rooftop solar. Let me tell you some things about our neighbors. They were gun-ho for rooftop solar. However, here's some things they figured out. If you have a major storm and you have roof damage, when you have rooftop solar, it's tougher to fix. When your panels start to wear out and the provider of those panels is no longer in business any longer, it becomes a tough issue. If you have a fire in a home and you have rooftop solar, it's tougher to put the fire out because fire fights from the top to the bottom. And lastly, they said, I actually had a home with rooftop solar on it, and the people who wanted to buy the home weren't into rooftop solar, didn't want the problems with rooftop solar. So they asked me to relate it to their industry. And so we talked about it a little bit more, and they said to me, look, and one was head of our retail group, said, if I was in Nordstrom's, this is the equivalent to that. And this is a little sarcastic, but I think it drives the point home. If Nordstrom's was doing what the utility business is doing today, they'd say, you know what, we have a new way to sell retail clothing to you. We're going to put a clothing store in your home. We're going to put sewing machines and pressing machines in your home, and we're going to ask you then to make your own clothes, et cetera. And here's the beauty of it. You get to buy your own machines, you get to buy your own pressing machines, et cetera, et cetera. That's a slight exaggeration, but their point is that technology allows you to take steps beyond that. And their point to me was, on the Nordstrom example, is, technology enabled the industry to have suppliers and buyers bypass the old distribution system, essentially, and move to the internet. And because they were slightly sleeping at the switch in that industry, they discovered that if they didn't pick up technology very quickly, they were going to be out of business. That could be analogous to us, and I'll get to that point in just a minute. The other one was my counterpart in telecom, who has maybe the greatest story of all industries in terms of their shift lately. But he said, yeah, and he was maybe beating me up a little bit more after the retail folks did, but he said, listen, in telecom, that'd be equivalent to us saying we have a new way for you to do phone service. We're going to put the cell towers on your property. You're going to own the cell tower. It's going to be great. It's going to be great. Okay, and they were being slightly sarcastic, but not that much. And that is that the thought process in our industry may be a little bit behind the times in terms of how quickly technology is moving. And so I would suggest a couple of things have to happen in terms of paradigm shift. First of all, is that we need to have a partnering network. Like retail and like comms developed over time. Retail with a little bit more panic probably than comms. Comms evolved more over the years. Retail is evolving out of, I would argue, pure survival. But partners are going to be important. They've been important to this business. Technology partners like my company, like GE that you heard from today, I think are absolutely necessary, because as much as you're spending on innovation, you can't spend nearly what we can spend in innovation. Innovation is going to be important to the future of the business. So I think partners that bring new technologies, partners that help you achieve policy objectives and bring better service to customers, all while maintain your mandate of providing secure and reliable and affordable power, I think is extremely important. And let me tell you, the byline in other industries is keep it simple for the customer. Keep it simple for the customer. So I think that's really important for us. The second thing we have to do is change the regulatory paradigm to encourage utilities to think differently. We need regulatory change to align with technology to make sure that utilities are able to play in this game on an even platform. And I would argue we did that in the IPP industry. I'm old enough to remember this industry when IPPs were new. If you remember the early days of the IPP industry, it absolutely stalled in the middle 80s. Why did it stall? It stalled because power purchase contracts were not of any interest to the utilities. Why? Because they couldn't put them in rate base. Why? Because the accounting rules didn't treat them as brick and mortar. Once the accounting rules changed, and we got that change to happen within the industry, then all of a sudden regulators said, hey, you know what? Putting them in rate base is a good idea, and utilities became interested in the IPP business. So I think we fundamentally need to change the way we do those businesses, and we have to have those two paradigm shifts. I would also say, and I would echo one of the comments earlier already, is let the utilities in early. just like in the IPP industry, we kept the utilities out for a long time. Once we let them in, they've actually been, there's about a handful of utilities or IPPs that are still in this business, but that mantle has been picked up by the utility industry. If you look at what Southern's doing, or FPL, or some of the other utilities that are here today, there's been a lot of movement in that industry by utilities themselves. So one quick comment too around regulators. I think in the short term, there's a couple things we can do on the regulatory side. One, PUCs can move in the short term to better define value streams for customers and utilities for DERs and storage to incent smart grid integration. And I think that's an area we've got to do a lot more work. In the long term, obviously, commissions need to be engaged in that discussion around the art of the possible. What is possible, and how will regulation be designed to allow the art of the possible to actually happen? And finally, I would just close it saying, I also think PUCs should encourage utilities to invest in sophisticated cloud-based IT platforms. The industry is way behind in that particular area. Technology, for once in this industry's life, is moving way quicker than the industry is responding. We need to take full advantage of that.
Thank you so much, Roger. Let's open this up now to the discussants. And Chairman Hawk, some exciting things going on in Ohio. Would you like to illuminate those for us?
Absolutely. Thanks, Bob, and thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Asim Haq. I'm the chairman of the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. I'm going to artfully dodge the question of who can play behind the meter, but there's a reason for that. So last week, the PUCO announced the launch of its own grid modernization proceeding that we have titled Power Forward. We have been planning what Power Forward should look like I've been talking about it now for a couple of years, but certainly over the last year since I was sworn in as chair in May, we've been talking about what Power Forward should look like. We have spent a lot of time analyzing other states. Where we landed up was with a proceeding that is built upon two pillars. The proceeding will be built upon the first pillar, which is innovation, both technological and regulatory innovation. We played with concepts that I think we utilize in the industry with some frequency: reliable, clean, efficient, customer control. What we found was that in our thinking, especially in Ohio, where there has just been so much what I'll just call turmoil over the past few years associated with, you name it, renewable mandates, energy efficiency mandates, what to do about generation that's owned by the formerly vertically integrated affiliate. So many of those concepts have been started to be utilized as political footballs, and we didn't want that. We wanted the focus to really be about truly innovation, but not just a discussion of innovation, just to talk about innovation. I mean, it's such an easy thing as being in the political sphere to just grab innovation and say, we're going to talk about innovation. Who the heck doesn't like innovation? Everybody likes innovation. Not just innovation to talk about innovation, but truly innovation that will serve to enhance the customer electricity experience. And that piece is an extremely important component and pillar of Power Forward. We are not going to advance a particular technology, or we are not going to begin the proceeding with an end stage of we are going to advance DERS or a particular facet of the latest and greatest in innovation in our industry. We are going to look at all of this holistically. And at the end of the day, what we hope is, and let me just describe a little bit about the various phases that we will undertake. Phase one is going to be, in order to try and engage Ohioans, a true glimpse of the future. Some of the folks in the room have already been invited to or have requested to speak at that particular phase. We hope to get a true-on glimpse of what the future can be for Ohioans. From there, I call this a funnel approach. From there, we will start filtering down into what tech is actually necessary to create that future. And then last, where the gloves will undoubtedly come off, the rate making and regulation associated with pushing that tech out to yield the future that we all hope for in the state. When all is said and done, the plan is to put out what I'll call a vision document, which is effectively here's what we think fits for the state of Ohio, and here's how we think we can get there from both a regulatory and legal standpoint, also being suggestive to our state's legislature. Now, who gets to play? I have said this for some time now. I think that this is the next great frontier of competitive forces versus monopolistic forces, okay? And if anybody knows my approach and how I have proceeded to analyze major cases that we've seen in the state of Ohio, what I'll tell you is I'm interested in the perspectives, and I'm interested in data, and I'm interested in facts, and I'm interested in analysis to say who should be able to play. I see positives on both sides. I see negatives on both sides. I'm skeptical of everybody, and at the same time, I hope for the best and brightest future for the state of Ohio. We'll figure out who gets to play.
I'm Doug Little from the Arizona Corporation Commission. I left 90-degree weather to come here. Don't ask me why. Actually, I did it for Lisa. But I think a couple of things. First of all, I think we've allowed ourselves to narrow the definition of what DER is all about too much. In many people's way of thinking about it, DER is residential rooftop, and that's actually a lot more. One of the things that we've seen a tremendous amount of work being done in Arizona is for companies that have set forth sustainability goals, energy goals that they have, Google, other companies of that type. We have a large Apple facility in the Phoenix area that has very large sustainability goals. What's happened is we've allowed the definition to become too narrow. I think we should be thinking more about the broader definition of DER to include small commercial, both commercial and industrial organizations. And if you look at the trends that at least I'm seeing in the industry right now, by encouraging these larger C&I installations, we have a much better potential for doing aggregation in quantities that the utilities begin to be able to manage usefully. I think the other piece of it, though, is look at what's happening in Frank mentioned this. Look at what's happening at FERC right now. They have a notice of proposed rulemaking to talk about how we would integrate DER and storage aggregators into the organized markets. So I think what we've got to do is look at a little bit different approach. And I think one of the things that I would say is there's an opportunity for partnership. Vendors that work with these companies, like the big C&I companies, they should work with the utilities, because by working with utilities, you can do things like identify stress points in the distribution grid and say, let's figure out how we can relieve some of those stress points and actually reduce the need to go out and make remedial investments in the distribution grid in certain parts of the grid. The other thing is that we talked about this a little bit in our commission, the idea of locational marginal pricing for DER. And while we thought that might be a little bit too complex, I think it does make sense to look at the distribution grid with respect to what portions of the grid in your service territory are better able to handle large penetrations of DERs, because, quite frankly, there are some portions of the Phoenix area, the grid's 50 years old, and it simply can't support large penetrations of distributed resources. On the other hand, there are other parts that are brand new, that have the latest technology, that would fall into the category of what I would call smart grid, and that is something that DER could could easily be integrated into. I'd like to talk some more about some storage stuff a little bit later, but I think we just need to think about it in a little broader way and think about how we can do things in a way that makes sense for both the utilities and the vendors that are offering these technologies.
I'd like to expand on that a little bit. Certainly the utilities and the vendors are important, but when you're talking about the framework, I think, the central question is what's good for customers, right? I'll go out on a limb and say that, I think it's fairly insane to exclude the utilities from this space. And when you consider kind of the impact of, uncoordinated deployment, you can really chip away a lot of the advantages by excluding the utilities who have the best visibility into the network and can really pinpoint where the value is. And I think we can mitigate the competitive advantages that they may have when we bring in non-utility vendors in the space.
Well, and Brian, that's an excellent point that perhaps I'll take up with you again in question 2, and that is the issue of how do we better support seamless grid upgrades and what the role of the utility is